2027, the Chinese Communist Party's deadline for conquering Taiwan. Xi Jinping plans to crush Taiwanese subversives by forcing them to listen to the Little Red Book on Chinese Audible in their BYDs on their commute to the Xiaomi factory. Sadly, I only made half of that up. Top US military, defense, and intelligence brass have said that China plans to seize Taiwan by 2027. If this is true, then altcoins are the last thing we should worry about getting nuked. So, why are they saying this, and should we be soy-facing too? Let's get to the bottom of it. My name is Guy, and you're watching The Coin Bureau. If China seized Taiwan by force, it could lead to a civilization-ending war between China and the US. Mighty bearish for risk assets, but, like I said, the markets would be the least of our concerns. But how likely is this scenario, and why would it happen? Well, to answer properly, we need to know a bit of history about China and Taiwan. This stuff goes back a very long way, but here's the TLDR. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War was coming to an end, but it was cut short before the victor's military campaign was complete. The losing side fled to Taiwan, where it called itself the Republic of China, or ROC, and claimed to be the only legitimate government of all of China. The winning side, meanwhile, the Communist People's Liberation Army, or PLA, planned to cross the Taiwan Strait, evict the ROC, and reunify the country under the newly formed People's Republic of China, or PRC. But this plan was frozen with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. The US Navy's 7th Fleet then parked itself in the middle of the Taiwan Strait, and that was pretty much that. So, unfinished business, with two governments claiming to be the real China. This was the origin of the Taiwan issue, and it's why American state-owned media still claims that China sees Taiwan as a rogue province. However, this isn't true. The PRC doesn't refer to Taiwan in this way. It just calls it China's Taiwan province. Much has changed in the last 75 years, and positions on the Taiwan issue have evolved. Most importantly, since 1979, the PRC has changed its policy from liberating Taiwan to a peaceful reunification with an autonomous Taiwan. That year, the National People's Congress announced that the PRC would, quote, take present realities into account in accomplishing the great cause of reunifying the motherland and respect the status quo on Taiwan and the opinions of people in all walks of life there, and adopt reasonable policies and measures in settling the question of reunification so as not to cause the people of Taiwan any losses. Now, the PRC draws the red line at independence for Taiwan, and this has never changed. And this is the core of the One China principle, which rejects the division of the mainland and Taiwan into two separate countries. For Beijing, all cross-strait dialogue begins from mutual acceptance of this principle. However, the PRC's stance on how One China should be defined has softened, so to speak. The ROC no longer contests the PRC's authority over the mainland, and Beijing's statements no longer identify One China with the PRC specifically. This is because of the 1992 consensus, which is an understanding that both sides of the Taiwan Strait can recognize that there is only one China, but have different interpretations of what that means. Beijing uses this as a starting point for cross-strait talks, but it is controversial in Taipei. Now, what's changed across the strait? Well, since the end of the ROC's military rule in 1987, the focus on Taiwan's political and legal identity is less about competing with the PRC over who the real China is, and more about whether Taiwan should formally declare independence, seek some kind of unification with the mainland, or maintain the status quo. The two main parties in Taiwan are the Kuomintang, or KMT, and the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP. Nowadays, the KMT tends to favour cross-strait dialogue and more amicable relations with Beijing. When the KMT has been in power, this has mostly been the case, with various quasi-official exchanges, agreements, visits, and policy developments taking place between 1987 and 1995, and between 2008 and 2016. The KMT's position has changed quite a lot over the years, but generally speaking, they're unlikely to do anything that could upset Beijing too much. By contrast, the DPP is the secessionist camp. These guys are in a tighter spot because, as we all know, formally declaring independence is a recipe for trouble, to say the least. So, the DPP rejects the One China principles in the streets, but avoids making any sudden moves in the sheets, so to speak. For example, current President Lai Ching-te previously said he was, quote, a pragmatic worker for Taiwanese independence. However, as he rose up the ranks of government, he changed his tune and now says that there's no need to declare independence because, quote, Taiwan is already a sovereign independent country called the Republic of China. This is a way of maintaining peace, which it's safe to say most people on Taiwan want, while also giving a middle finger to Beijing, which is a little more divisive. Naturally, Beijing does not like the DPP at all. However, more than political posturing in Taiwan, the PRC is concerned about the DPP pursuing diplomatic recognition abroad and the backing it receives from Western governments. The DPP is quite dependent on the latter, so we should probably talk about it, and why Beijing gets so upset about it. Until the early 1970s, the US backed the ROC's military dictatorship and its claims to represent all of China. When this pretense wore too thin, then President Richard Nixon pulled the rug and switched sides. The ROC was booted out of the UN Security Council and replaced by the PRC. Then, Nixon set about establishing a relationship with the PRC. This began with the Shanghai Communique of 1972, the fundamental basis for all US-PRC relations ever since. It says, quote, the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. Under the agreement, the US would withdraw its nuclear weapons and troops from Taiwan, abandon diplomatic ties with the ROC, and stop selling them weapons, among other commitments. However, the US immediately started reneging on these commitments by establishing an embassy in Taiwan and continuing arms sales to the ROC. Now, more recently, Beijing has been peeved about the role of Western non-government organizations, or NGOs, in Taiwan, both real and fake, like the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED. If you're not familiar, the NED was a product of the NGOization of US foreign policy in the 1980s. In the post-Watergate era, mounting public revelations about the CIA resulted in a redistribution of some of its functions to civil society organizations, and the NED was created for this purpose. The NED says it exists, quote, to promote freedom around the world, which means destabilizing foreign governments that Washington disapproves of. Don't take my word for it, though. Alan Weinstein, who helped draft the legislation that created the NED, said in 1991, quote, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. Former CIA officer and whistleblower Philip Agee said much the same in 1995. Quote, nowadays, instead of having just the CIA going around behind the scenes and trying to manipulate the process secretly by inserting money here and instructions there and so forth, they now have a sidekick, which is this National Endowment for Democracy, NED. Of course, color revolutions don't come cheap. The NED was receiving its entire 9-figure budget from the US government every year until it got doged in 2025. Anyway, critics have accused the NED of drumming up support for Taiwan's 2014 Sunflower Revolution, in which protesters stormed Taiwan's legislature to stop the KMT government from passing a cross-strait trade liberalization bill. The scenes of protesters storming the assembly have since been compared to the events of January 6, 2021 at the US Capitol building, although in this case the Taiwanese protesters enjoyed the support of Hillary Clinton and got to visit the US Congress and State Department afterwards. The KMT flopped in elections in 2014 and 2016 and were replaced by the DPP, who have been in power and seeking diplomatic recognition of Taiwan ever since, much to Beijing's displeasure and the delight of Western China hawks. Beijing has, though, used its clout to crush most of these diplomatic efforts that involved international institutions and non-Western countries. The NED, however, was undeterred. In 2022, it co-hosted the Global Assembly of the World Movement for Democracy in Taipei with the DPP. European lawmakers and pro-US think tanks were invited to hype up a Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow narrative and open up a new front line of democratic struggle on the island. In 2023, the NED's president flew back to Taiwan to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the anti-China think tank Taiwan Foundation for Democracy and present DPP President Tsai Ing-wen with a Democracy Service Medal. The PRC hated this, which was a problem for Taiwan because the mainland is its biggest export market, a major source of investment and also tourism revenue, all of which started drying up. The US partially compensated for this with trade of its own, ramping up weapons sales and formally declaring Taiwan a vital US interest, which places it under the US nuclear umbrella, at least in theory. This help has come at a cost for Taiwan, however. Washington has forced Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, or TSMC, the world's most valuable maker of semiconductors, to open operations in the US, against the complaints of the company's leadership. President Trump is now trying to get TSMC to transfer its world-leading semiconductor processing technology to the US in a joint venture with its floundering US competitor, Intel. According to polling shared by Taiwan's deputy legislative speaker in February, some 85% of people in Taiwan are opposed to this technology transfer. TSMC is of such strategic importance that it's been described as Taiwan's sacred mountain and its tech as the island's silicon shield. In other words, TSMC is Taiwan's leverage. Anyway, since the election of President Lai in 2024, the DPP has doubled down on its current trajectory. The party has become increasingly unpopular for, among other things, heaping praise on the recently impeached former South Korean President Yoon's failed military coup and for urging President Lai to follow suit. If you're not up to speed, Yoon was a former head of the prosecution who tried to have the leader of the opposition jailed on a great variety of charges, none of which stuck. As president, he was an alcoholic who showed up late to work constantly, distrusted his own government, and outsourced policymaking to his favorite YouTubers. Yoon and his wife were engulfed in many corruption scandals, including serial stock market and electoral manipulation, leading to his approval rating cratering to 17%. When he couldn't take it anymore, he snapped, declared martial law, and sent the army to dissolve the parliament and kidnap lawmakers. The plan was quickly foiled by members of the public. Surprisingly, though, months of planning had gone into Yoon's failed pivot to military dictatorship. Also on the schedule were plots to torture lawmakers, disappear between 500 and 10,000 public figures, and provoke a war with North Korea. Yoon's rationale was that South Korea was being overrun by Chinese and North Korean spies, information which he'd gathered from YouTube. Now, Yoon was hated in South Korea, but has been celebrated as a visionary in DC, and the sight of him self-cooing his way out of office was painful for China hawks who'd been counting on his success. In contrast, Taiwan's DPP lawmakers considered this his finest moment and advised Lai to try something similar. Now, although not at the level of martial law yet, allegations of political repression have increased under Lai. Most notably, the leader of Taiwan's third-largest political party, Ko Wen-jae, has been in jail since December in what critics allege is a political stitch-up orchestrated by the DPP, prosecutors, and a certain local tabloid. Ko's party favours improving ties with China through cultural exchanges and economic cooperation. And it also happens to control the tie-breaking vote in the legislature. Say, that's some nice leverage you've got there. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it. Anyway, Ko's prolonged detention on thin evidence has prompted massive anti-DPP protests in Taiwan. And aside from these allegations, there's widespread general discontent with DPP rule and increased fears of war. At the rate things are going, they're expected to lose the 2028 elections. Now, of course, this is still quite a long way off, but the DPP is the secessionist camp, and they've advanced their cause just about as far as they can already without bringing the People's Liberation Army crashing down on their heads. The problem is, this is what Washington's China hawks want, and they have $1 trillion defense budget at stake. Now, what might happen if the DPP loses to the KMT in 2028? Well, the KMT sure as hell won't declare independence, so then, what are the warhawks supposed to do? Taiwan isn't going to invade itself. It's almost like time is running out. From our perspective, this might be one of the reasons why they've pulled forward their deadline for China to invade Taiwan to 2027. You see, this is only the latest in a series of dates floated for an alleged Taiwan invasion plan that periodically go viral in Washington. Originally, it was supposed to be 2049, the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the PRC. But the alleged date keeps getting closer. First 2040, then 2035, then 2030, with the latest widely propagandized date being 2027. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and former President Biden have warned of Chinese action then, and the US Navy is explicitly preparing for war in 2027. However, China's President Xi has reportedly expressed bafflement at this new timeline. This is according to an American official who was present at the 2023 US-China summit in San Francisco and later spoke to the press. According to their telling, quote, Xi basically said, "Look, I hear all these reports in the United States of how we're planning for military action in 2027 or 2035. There are no such plans. No one has talked to me about this." Why then did 2027 turn into a viral meme in the US foreign policy establishment? Well, it all began in 2021. China's People's Liberation Army was making rapid progress towards its modernization goals and was developing manufacturing capacity far beyond that of the US. So, concerned American lawmakers created the Pacific Deterrence Initiative to rush more money to US forces in the region. At a congressional hearing, a senator asked Admiral Phil Davidson, the retiring head of the US Indo-Pacific Command, whether China's actions under Xi Jinping's leadership had changed the odds of conflict around Taiwan. Davidson said, quote, "The threat is manifest during this decade," and specified, quote, "in fact, in the next 6 years." According to one congressional aide who spoke to Defense News, this eerily specific prediction set alarm bells ringing in Washington, where it was dubbed the Davidson window. It seems to have done the trick too, as Congress has been authorizing more and more money for the Indo-Pacific Command. The aide said, quote, "You can draw a direct line between Admiral Davidson's comments and the ability to get something like the foreign military financing for Taiwan through." In a later hearing, General Mark Milley, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, claimed that Davidson's assessment was based on a speech by President Xi where he allegedly called on the PLA to, quote, "develop capabilities to seize Taiwan and move it from 2035 to 2027. Funnily enough, though, US officials have never been able to produce this speech. Milley was later asked in Congress whether there was any other witness who'd said China was planning to invade Taiwan by 2027. He said no, but added, quote, "Intent is something that can change quickly." Now that is a good one. The 2027 date was soon confirmed as the new party line by CIA Director Bill Burns. Top military brass continued repeating it, and then Secretary of State Antony Blinken claimed in late 2022 that China intended to unify with Taiwan on a, quote, "much faster timeline than the US had previously expected." The timeline got out of hand in early 2023 after a memo from General Mike Minahan, head of Air Mobility Command, leaked to the media. Quote, "My gut tells me we will fight China in 2025, he wrote. After this, the Pentagon had to intervene to enforce some message discipline. Suddenly, war with China became, quote, "neither imminent nor inevitable," and this remained the party line for the rest of the Biden administration. Well, that's certainly a relief. Of course, by that time, the meme had already produced some great clickbait and even better defense budgets. We should still be wary about China hawks scaremongering, though, because they are a permanent feature of the military-industrial complex, and they are indeed running out of time if they want to start a war with China. This is partially because of the threat of local changes breaking up the US war plan. Not only Taiwan, but also regional partners South Korea and the Philippines will have elections before 2028 in which more dovish and less pliable opposition parties stand a good chance of winning and upsetting Washington's checkers board. More importantly, though, efforts to frustrate China's growth have failed. With 230 times the shipbuilding capacity of the US, the PLA adds more equipment in a year than the Pentagon does in a decade, and for much cheaper. Meanwhile, the expansion of BRICS and China's Belt and Road Initiative are rendering US sanctions increasingly useless, and China well prepared to ride out Trump's trade war. Meanwhile, Washington's involvement with wars in the Middle East and Ukraine have torched much of America's soft power in the developing world, while the Trump administration is simultaneously severing ties with Europe, trying to annex Canada and Greenland, and calling Chinese people peasants, while tariff-stricken US allies scramble to form closer trade relations with Beijing. The ever-shrinking window for China to invade Taiwan shows us the fear of the hawks in Washington. If they want a war that they can win, then the clock is very much ticking. But they'll need to shoot a buzzer-beating 4-point floater, whereas China, well, it just needs to run the clock. Anywho, the trade war alone has hurt my bags enough, so let's hope cooler heads prevail and nobody will do anything stupid involving, weapons. In the meantime, let's think happy thoughts, like Larry Fink saying BTC could become a global reserve currency. Wait, do we want him saying that? Well, you can find out in this video over here. That's all from me for now, though. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Guy, over and out.